Howdy, folks. Welcome to another special edition of the Texas SignalCast. I'm your host, Joe Desotel, and I'm here with David Leffler. Hey, David. How you doing?
Hey, Joe, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so David is a regular contributor to the Texas Signal, and we do sort of these special, more in-depth pieces on issues that are going on. So we have a little more time to dig a little deeper into what's actually going on. And today we are going to be talking about Prop B in Austin, the ban on homeless camping, and sort of what effect that has had statewide, and also what is coming next with that, because all we had in May was the vote, but now it's kind of like what happens next, and it is causing a lot of issues throughout the city on what's actually going to happen. So, David, I know that you have been following this pretty closely. What are some of your initial thoughts after you saw the results?
Yeah, so for context, right? This vote took place on May 1st, and as with many things that take place in Austin from a municipal level, it had a lot of attention statewide, including from Governor Abbott and a lot of the Republican leadership in the legislature. Kind of long story short, again, this ordinance was seeking to reinstate the camping ban in Austin that had been repealed by City Council back in 2019. It had been a very hotly contested issue over the last couple of years, and had really ramped up thanks to Save Austin Now, which is a conservative-backed coalition that I know that we're going to talk about a bit later here. But yeah, to make a long story short, the proposition passed by a vote of 58 to 42% across Austin. And I know that going into it, when you and I had spoken before about this issue in late April, we both knew that this was going to be a pretty dicey election, and that there was a pretty good chance that this would be the reality that we're now facing. So the big question that this, of course, leaves us with, and that we're going to be exploring throughout this conversation, is where the hell do we go next? Because the answer is definitely not clear, nor was it set out to be by those who were seeking to reimpose the ban.
Yeah, I mean, and you kind of have to give some props to the conservative organizers who did this. I mean, they recognized a issue that a lot of Austinites were talking about, that they clearly blamed the city council for, and they capitalized off of it in a really big way. And we look at the breakdown of the votes and the areas of town, and the breakdown by primary history, who showed up at the polls. And it's pretty clear that it wasn't just Republicans that
Yeah,
supported this. It was actually a lot of Democrats and a lot of
yeah,
people who have not previously voted in a primary before. And that just tells you that, when you find an issue that people are talking about, you can use it to organize a base and bring voters out who may have not paid very close attention, but they saw this in their daily life, walking around the city. It had affected them in a certain way, and these conservative activists were able to turn that into a ballot proposition, which in Austin is not that hard to do. I think you only need roughly 20,000 or so signatures in a city of a
yeah.
million. And this has come up before many times, that a lot of people believe that number is way too low. That number should be higher, because the way the tactics that are used to get a lot of these signatures, I mean, there have been stories done on how people who are tasked with, just getting a certain number of signatures will tell the signers anything. Like,
Yeah.
just depends on how they feel about a certain issue. It's like, yeah, sure, it'll do that. Just sign here and we'll get it on the ballot. And this doesn't, make this doesn't require you to vote a certain way. It's just you have to be a registered voter if you sign the petition, and then the city council is doesn't really have much of a choice. They basically have to, get the ballot language set, and then they put it on the ballot for the next available election time. In this case, it was May, and I think May also probably benefited this group, because it's generally a lower turnout election. This actually turned out to be a very high turnout May election,
Mm.
but they had a pretty formidable campaign. And as Republicans tend to do, it wasn't isolated to Austin. They made this sort of a statewide issue and even a national issue where they could get money, raise money. And they did. And they raised quite a bit. And as you mentioned, this is Republican backed Save Austin Now PAC, which is led by the local Travis County GOP chair, Matt Makoviak, and some of his, followers, and one of the only conservative city council member who is now, Austin has 10 city council members. We only have one true Republican conservative. She was just elected partially on this issue, and took that seat. And it just shows you how even one little crack in the system for progressives and Democrats can just blow a huge hole open in all the progress that has been made in the city. And so she is one of the leaders now and seen as a movement leader in the city because of this issue. And as we'll talk about in a minute, they're not stopping here. They're moving on to the next issue, which is going to be police funding and doing a very similar move for November election.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I think more than anything else is everything you're alluding to, that starting with the city council getting its first Republican member at the end of last year, and then leading up to this vote, it's been a real reality check for Austin leadership, right? I mean, up until then, there had been a uniform Democratic stronghold on every kind of city leadership position that was elected, which felt like the norm, I guess, in some ways in Austin, being such a progressive city. But it's that hasn't always been that way, and it's unrealistic to assume it would always be that way. But it's also been a reality check on the city's approach to homelessness, right? I mean, whenever this camping ban was repealed, one of the main kind of points of that strategy was that leaders, and Mayor Steve Adler has said this multiple times, was to expose the severity of this issue to voters, to say, hey, these people who are experiencing homelessness and living on Austin streets, they've been here. They have just been forced to stay out of sight, in fields, in forests, just very much to where they were forced to, again, be out of sight and out of mind for Austin voters and for just people living here. And the idea was, let's get, this issue in front of people to expose the need for this, to that way, hopefully that would compel voters to allocate more funding for shelters, for mental health services, for job services, and for affordable housing. And to many extents that did work for some time, right? I mean, they were able to purchase 4 hotels across the city for tens of millions of dollars. They were able to approve a large affordable housing bond, I believe, when it was approved in 2018. Is that correct? I believe
sounds right. Yeah.
It was one of the largest. I think it was the largest affordable housing municipal bond approved in Texas at the time. So there were a lot of positives that came with that. But obviously, as we're seeing with this May election here, people's patience wore thin. And again, as you mentioned, this wasn't just Republicans who voted to reinstate this. There were a lot of Democrats that decided to vote for it as well. So I think this is going to cause a lot of soul searching, I think, for some time for Austin's leadership and for a lot of people who are working so hard to try to address the mounting homelessness issue that's facing not just Austinites, but a lot of larger cities around the state and country.
Yeah, and I'm just really hoping that we, as progressives, can recognize the learning opportunity here, because this is going to continue to happen. And when you look at the rhetoric that was used on both sides, but on the progressive side, it was like you're an evil, awful person if you vote for Prop B. But that obviously didn't work, and we need a better approach to this. And backing up, when the council made this decision, it would have been, politically more viable to have had the plan rolled out first and have a place for these people to go
Right.
before decriminalizing it, even though I understand like, well, it's wrong to criminalize it. So therefore we should just, that's the first thing we can do. That's an actionable thing we can do while we address, giving them a place to go. And I've been a part of the homelessness count here. It's called the point in time count in Austin for a couple of years. And essentially you're exactly right. You go through the woods and you walk through the woods at known campsites. You talk to them, you ask them how long they've been there and how many people are with them and stuff like that. And then you get sort of a total number. And what we're finding is like the number of people has not substantially increased.
Right.
So that's what people believe because that's what they see. And that is what has been used. And yeah, I mean, it's clearly unsustainable no matter how you feel about the issue, what was going on in Austin. And we've got to be a little better at thinking about rolling out solutions, because what happened with Prop B, now we end up recriminalizing it and we still don't have the solutions. The pro Prop B folks used all kinds of rhetoric, which you mentioned, which was like, this is going to help the homeless by essentially recriminalizing it. Of course, we know that's not true. And now that that's happened, they are just as fervent about moving these people out with no plan. And they're not like pivoting towards, okay, here's our plan. Now that we put this ballot initiative, we got it passed. They're just moving on to the next issue. And that's the thing that we've got to learn as progressives, as they are using this simply as an organizing tool, and it's very successful. And we are just chasing the shiny object if we just keep following them around and letting them lead us this way, instead of us taking the leadership and really trying to solve this issue. And so, you mentioned it's the statewide effect. There was a bill that was passed to ban camping statewide. And so that passed as well. And the interesting part is one of the council members from suburban Austin, the senators from suburban Austin, Don Buckingham, had an amendment on the state bill that would essentially ban parks from consideration of temporary campsites, because the Prop B folks, pro Prop B, they basically said, look, we need to set up these sites because right now this is not good for the homeless people. There's no security, there's no sanitation, there's no resources. So we need established sites. And so after Prop B passed, the city put out a list of sites, and those included public parks, because it was basically all city owned land. So it was like, what can the city do? It could use city owned property. And they immediately came out against this plan with no plan of their own. But again, this is a continuation of attack on the city council. So you just got to remember what their goal is versus their stated goal, and versus what we're seeing and what we're actually fighting against. So they're now against the use of certain types of public land, and they had one of their senators propose and have amendment accepted that would also ban that from being used. So I don't know if you want to comment on any of that before.
Yeah. And I know we've talked about it in past conversations, but at the end of the day, right, this strikes at the challenges that progressives face when you're trying to provide a constructive solution to an incredibly complicated issue. And the opposition is not only, stoking fears and using misinformation, but is not really even pretending to have any semblance of a solution in place, because that's not the stated goal. Mm-hmm. Right. And not trying to backtrack too much, but I think you were spot on where in hindsight, the city should have either released the plan about what would happen if they were to repeal the camping ban and say, this is what we plan to do if we do it, or B, when they did that, having actionable steps ready to go right away. And I understand that, a lot of that comes down to funding they did not have. But it feels like kind of, taking the political temperature after doing something like that was a risk. And in many ways, they, instead of seeking to make this issue more in people's faces to where that they would then choose to allocate funding and vote in favor of addressing it. It actually, kind of backfired in the sense that the opposition, took that thing that was in their face and then just really was able to draw out, a myriad of anecdotes that may or may not have been true, but certainly weren't representative of, the large population of people that were living on Austin's streets. I'm sure you've heard similar things leading up to this vote, but I had people who, again, this is kind of the theme of the conversation, I know are Democratic voters, and voted pretty progressively. But then I heard them also say, things about, people carrying knives and situations like that, it just sounded very much like it was off of something off of Fox News. So, as those kind of conversations get more and more pervasive, and as a lot of times those conversations and articles don't actually include people who are experiencing homelessness, it's easier to kind of objectify them and place them in this kind of box, but what we think their life experiences were that led them to that point, which then is in turn easier to vilify them. So,
yeah.
But and as you're talking about also, if we're not able to put, use public spaces like parks, what are our options here?
Yeah, I mean, and it's not a great option to use, the parks for that. But we have to do something, and we have to. I mean, it's just a tough issue, and everything the state is doing is only making it more complicated. The state passing this bill, they didn't, allocate any money in the budget to solving this issue, and everything the state has ever done regarding mental health services or any other wraparound services or housing, property taxes, which make housing unattainable for a lot of people, affordable housing requirements, and even just yesterday when they were passing SB 14, which is an anti-worker bill. It takes away things like water breaks, and they barely got back in. And I'm proud to say my dad actually helped in this effort, but to get an amendment to make SB 14 a little less bad by allowing fair chance hiring back in. It would have also banned fair chance hiring. So if you had any type of criminal record in your past, that shows up before you even get an interview. And all fair chance hiring does is say, you do not have to disclose your criminal record until the interview process. So in other words, it just gets you past the resume.
That's right.
And somebody can interview you and talk to you, man, you seem like a really great candidate. And then you can talk about your criminal past. And so we got that put back in there. But every one of these things is a hurdle for people who are experiencing homelessness to get back into, permanent housing and back on their feet, to contributing in the way that most people expect the average citizen to do. And it makes it incredibly hard when we have the state doing these things. And you mentioned the knife. That ties into this so much. I actually was looking at earlier when I was doing research for this, a specific example of the Save Austin Now pack or whatever, sharing information about somebody wielding a knife and other people feeling unsafe. Well, it was the state legislature that allowed anyone to carry a machete around and a giant knife anywhere around, open carry, the same way they just did with guns. Exactly. And so if you're concerned about somebody with mental health issues or abusive past or whatever, carrying around deadly weapons, well, you don't have the Austin City Council to blame for that. That's the state legislature. And so everything that they do has compounded and complicated this issue and made it worse. And so, but that's not what people see, right? They live there in Austin. They see this, they see a knife, but they classify this person. They look at them as a homeless person. This is the city of Austin's fault. And they were able to masterfully take that issue and weaponize it against city council and the homeless population, obviously, as well. And so, it's really unfortunate. And one thing I wanted to show, since we're talking about this, is the map of the actual voting and what that looks like. So let me share my screen here. And you can see here that in the red areas, you saw the highest vote for Prop B in the western part of the city. This is a much higher income area of Austin. This is kind of nearing the suburbs and sort of Lakeway area out here, but these are high income areas people who may be venturing in the downtown and then seeing homelessness, pop up in parts of their neighborhood as well, and where people voted against Prop B, more central Austin and East Austin, people who are probably more, who are actually, we know, feeling the pressure of affordability in the city the most. So
Yeah.
they're probably like, hey, that could be me in a
Yeah.
month or two. The way, prices are going. I just told you I'm in the middle of moving right now myself because the previous landlord wanted to cash in on the crazy housing prices. And guess what? They sold my 3-2 house for like over $1 million. And I was lucky, I was so fortunate and lucky enough to be able to like quickly find another place in my same neighborhood. But that's not the experience for everyone. And other people who are renters who will get pushed out won't be in the city anymore. And so they don't have a choice. And tenants have almost zero rights in the state of Texas. So, so this, I don't know, did you want to comment on this map before I show sort of where the proposed sites are going to be?
Sure. Yeah. No, I think you hit it spot on that, on the west side of Austin, it's known to be very wealthy, and certainly predominantly white. And on the east and central parts of Austin, that is lesser so, especially in East Austin. And something to note here is not only that, as you really, astutely pointed out, that, in the areas that voted against it, so to keep, to ensure that the ban was not put back in place, not only are those places where people are more likely to be feeling the pressure of Austin's increasingly expensive cost of living, which, there's a trickle down effect of what's happening in Austin's housing market, right? Like, for context, Austin's average home price went up 29% from last year to this year. That's the highest in the country. In the first 3 months of 2021, the average home price in Austin went up $50,000, right? That has a cumulative effect on who can buy where. And then also, as you just mentioned, whether it's landlords, selling places that people are renting, or if it's people who are, there's just a higher competition for rental properties in general.
Mm-hmm.
I have friends who are searching for rental in Austin right now after their landlord has decided to try to evict them without notice.
Wow.
And every place they've applied to has had 10 applicants, right? So this is, again, it is a very complicated issue, but it's centered in affordability. But something else also I want to point out, as you look at this map, the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness are centered in the city's core. You'll also see that the people who voted to reinstate the ban likely aren't interacting with them, with people who are experiencing homelessness in any real way. As you mentioned, they're coming into town for food, entertainment, whatever it may be. So again, that centers around the idea that it's easier to cast someone else as the other whenever you're making a decision in this matter. Whereas if you have a chance to interact with people, I'm not saying every person in these big blue spots, is befriending people who are living on the streets right now, but it makes them more likely to be able to humanize someone if they're in your environment more frequently.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now let's look at where the city actually proposed to put these sites. So you'll notice something here. When we put them side by side, can you see these side by side?
Yes.
You can see that the people who voted to implement the ban almost have no sites that were selected for possible encampment sites, and essentially places that voted to not reinstitute the ban, have a majority. And you mentioned that there's also a racial component to this. This line, of course, is 35. It used to be called East Avenue in Austin back in 1928 when they did the master plan, and they forced all the African American people who were living here, former freedmen who had settled in this very nice part of town.
Yeah.
White people wanted those places. They forced them to move over here. And so now this has become the hot area of town. And now all these folks here are being pushed way out, outside of the city. And so it's just kind of happening all over again. And Natasha Harper Madison, who is the city council member for this area, also the only African American on city council, is pointing this out in a recent statement that Black leaders including Jeff Trevelyan, who's the commissioner of Travis County for this area, similar district area. They're pointing out the fact that this is harkens back to, sort of past inequities that this community has faced from the city, and how this thing keeps happening over and over and over again, because you have a bunch of people over here with a lot of power and money, and they kind of dictate, even in a 10-1 council situation setup, they still are the ones kind of running the show and dictating what happens in East Austin. And so that's one of the hurdles that's being faced right now with Prop B being passed. Now we have to do something. We're going to set these sites up. Now it sets up a whole nother big fight about where these sites are going to be.
Yeah.
And so the council member that we spoke about earlier, her name is Mackenzie Kelly. She's the only Republican on the city council. Now, she led the fight to end the ban. And the first thing she did when the ban passed was lead the fight to make sure not a single encampment would be in her district. And so this is the fight sort of, that we're moving towards. And so it's like you said, they're going to go somewhere, the woods, the creeks, and places like that. So what are we really going to do if we actually want to end homelessness other than jail? Because that seems to be the preferred method of some of the folks who supported the proposition, or who at least led the fight.
Yeah. And pardon my kind of rough count. I could be off on one or two, but before we started this conversation, I looked over this map, and if you look down, I-35 is this kind of dividing line. It's roughly, give or take 22, 23 of the 45 sites. It might be a bit more than that, actually, proposed for Austin. That was just released. None of these sites have been decided on, but it's around that. And so, that's more than half. It's also, when you think about Austin from not just an east and west, but a east, west, north, south, central, and all of those are in a kind of centered around specifically East Austin. It shows that, as you mentioned, not only strikes at racial disparities that have existed in Austin for, at this point, almost 100 years, since the 1928 master plan, as it was called, but it's the idea that these areas are being again forced to kind of endure the brunt of Austin's growth, right?
Mm-hmm.
As Austin has grown and exploded, all of the growth has happened in East Austin, and that's where home prices have gone up, and that's where, as you mentioned, people have been driven out. So this, unfortunately, is what happens when something like this is passed without a plan. Not only are people not being considered, right? As you mentioned, Councilmember Natasha Harper Madison, who's the mayor pro tem, says she wasn't.
Excuse me, yeah, mayor pro tem.
Yeah, she said she wasn't even consulted on this list. So the fact that this was released without some of the key leadership, not just among Austin's Black community, but among city leadership. I understand that city leaders were forced in a bind whenever this was passed because there wasn't a plan and they had to scramble. But it didn't have to be like this. And as we mentioned before, there was a pretty good, notion that there was a chance Prop B could have passed, which obviously it did. So the idea that there wasn't any kind of real infrastructure in place is disappointing, and it shouldn't have been that way.
Yeah. And so, a little bit more information on the sites, I think, that they were trying to set up. They did release with the sites information on what kind of services will be taking place at these sites. It's, I think, $1.3 million a year for a 50-person site, or 1.9 for a 100-person site, for security, storage, transportation, water, trash, utilities, and things like that. So really the whole thing. But it's, obviously that's a significant budget. We have about 1,000 homeless people in the city of Austin. So, technically that could come to, close to, $15 or $20 million a year. It's a very significant sum of money. But it's interesting because the folks that push this Prop B, like I said, they're basically on to the next thing. They had a press conference just within the last couple of days that announced their next sort of petition drive that they're doing. In this case, it's about police funding, and the other major issue that has come up over the past year in the city of Austin, falsely claiming that the city of Austin has defunded the police. I mean, the police budget is 40% of the city budget. They're not defunded.
Yeah.
But this would essentially mandate a certain level of funding. This is also being echoed at the state level. This was one of Greg Abbott's priority bills, which of course he names the city of Austin in each one of these posts that he does about it. And in the meantime, what I saw about a week ago before they announced this, they sent me a text message, I guess, because I voted in the election and in May, and it's a very long survey, and it's asking about this issue. How did I vote on the homelessness issue, the ban? What do I think about police funding? What do I think about Matt Makoviak? And what do I think about Mackenzie Kelly? And what do I think about the fact that it's local Republicans that are pushing these petitions? Does that increase my support? Does that decrease my support? So it's very clear that they have high ambitions for both themselves, but for the conservative movement in the city. And they are essentially targeting the entire city council. And we're going to see probably over the next cycle of a huge surgence of conservative candidates with a single message, most likely, that they're going to back the police. They're going to back the police. They're going to, increase funding, make our city safe, because these, Marxist city council members are destroying our Austin. I mean, that has basically been their talking points, and it's going to continue to be that based on the poll that I saw, the questions, how they were worded, and then this new announcement that we see moving forward from the same group, Save Austin Now PAC, which is essentially now this sort of police, not even reform at all. It's really more of a police funding, because as far as I can tell from the press release, there was nothing about police accountability. It was just focused on increasing training, which is good, and then tying the number of police officers directly to the population. So in other words, like, as the city grows, they would be mandated to hire a certain number of police officers.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary, right? I mean, we were talking about this before. It's scary to think that, based on those questions, that one, right, that at the end of the day, a lot of people who are influenced by Save Austin Now, the coalition, the PAC, weren't aware of who was behind it, right? Like, and it was a well-funded PAC. I think it was, at the end of the day, it was over $2 million. I want to say were spent on Prop B alone. So the idea that, already those kind of levers of power being pulled without any kind of knowledge of who's behind them is concerning enough. But as you mentioned, yeah, certainly the testing of the waters as to, hey, like, can we kind of reveal who we are, see how people feel about that, right? And by focusing on this issue, as you so well put, and it's almost like a Trojan horse, right? The idea that Austin went from uniformly Democratic city council and mayor to all of a sudden, it's a realistic possibility that there will be more challengers across the districts, and as well as in the mayoral election next year. That's a distinct possibility, and in many ways probably could be a reality. And so, yeah, it's scary. And I think the bottom line is that there's gonna have to be, a better job done by local leaders of explaining complicated issues. And what do I mean by that is saying that if you want to address public safety, more police funding is not going to achieve that, right? They're gonna have to lead the horse to water here and explain to people that, mental health services, that affordable housing, that providing people access to better paying jobs and providing access to people to drug treatment, all of those things are how you ensure public safety, right? Even talking about some of these sites that are being proposed. I was reading about this. I took a couple notes here, but apparently several of the sites are in floodplains. Several are in high risk of wildfire. Colony Park, which is a 200-acre tract of land east of I-35. They don't have grocery stores. They don't have healthcare facilities. They don't have the infrastructure to be able to house these people. So again, this doesn't embody public health. This doesn't embody public safety. So the key here is going to be explaining that to voters in a way that's simple enough and makes sense, that again, connecting the dots between these various services and why it will make your community safer, why it'll make your neighbor more successful, and why it'll make you, enjoy your city more. And that's not simple, but it is going to be necessary to combat these very single-minded and oftentimes misleading campaigns that are again fueling this kind of rise of conservatism in Austin.
Yeah, and especially when the opposition's only really has one line, which is make Austin safer or keep Austin safe or whatever. Because who doesn't want that, right? I mean,
exactly.
But there's no depth to it. There's no real plan to it. We could always rely on Republicans telling us that throwing money at a solution is not our solution, and yet here we find them. All they want to do is just add money to certain budgets because it's politically expedient at this time. So. Yeah, I think we'll keep an eye on this issue. I don't know if there's any last comments that you want to make about this. I know you listened to our mayor on Joe Rogan talking about this issue, which I'm sorry you had to listen to Joe Rogan, but I know we kind of talked before. We have mixed feelings about people like him and kind of giving his platform sort of air, but I think. In this situation, Joe Rogan has the biggest podcast in the world. So there's nothing we're doing we can do to deplatform him, and so to speak. Yeah. So adding some sense to the mix and a different perspective, I think is something that we have to do when somebody has that type of platform. Mm-hmm. Now if he was just some, kind of small time right winger in city of Austin with a podcast, then I'd say no. But I mean, the biggest podcast in the world, like we've got to inject some sense into it, because every now and then Joe Rogan will say, "Oh yeah, I shouldn't have said. Oh, I was dumb. Don't listen to me. I'm an idiot." Like okay, well, let's have some people on who can talk sense, and then maybe when you say something stupid, can correct you. Before you have your next conspiracy theorist on. But the folks who listen, and it's good to have other perspectives come on, because if we could change a few minds, even. I think it's going to help in the long run, because like you said, this is going to take a long time to educate folks on the things that need to be done to actually solve these problems.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I don't typically listen to Joe Rogan. I'd seen that Mayor Adler was on there, and so for the sake of research for this podcast, I sacrificed my time for that. So just so we're clear.
Thank you for your service.
But yeah, no, it was. I agree with you. And for those who aren't aware yet, Joe Rogan, of course, lives in Austin now. And in many ways, his move here embodies, again, a shift that is happening in Austin as it's grown more expensive. I don't want to, get too caught up in singular examples, but, one of the things that Governor Abbott, I've seen him tweet about more times I'd like to admit, where he's saying how, people moving here from California are ones who are trying to escape taxes. They're not liberals moving here. And I don't know to what extent that is true, but there are certainly some examples of that with Joe Rogan and with other people I've talked to here who have, are
Elon Musk.
Elon Musk. Yes, absolutely. Who are infusing a little bit more of a libertarian bent in Austin, for sure. But I do think it was good for Mayor Adler to hopefully at least address some of that. He hasn't always been the most forward-facing or compelling mayor. So I think it was good for him to go out there and be able to talk about some of those things. To what extent it was effective, I'd have to ask your average Joe Rogan listener. But one thing I did think that he was enlightening with it is the one that he admitted, like, hey, some of these we talked about, like, I think there's a quote from me. He said, "We should have identified at that point where people could go and not go, and we didn't do that." And he's talking about whenever they lifted the ban, like, we should have had a plan in place. And it's important to acknowledge those mistakes rather than just, digging deeper in this idea that we did everything right. Because I do think there was good intent there. It just wasn't carried out necessarily in the right way. And then he also, Joe Rogan, he posed the question of, people preferring a sort of quote unquote vagabond lifestyle, and kind of, furthering this like myth that people choose to live on the streets. And obviously, as Adler pointed out, and as, most people point out who are aware of what this issue looks like, is that's not the case. The vast majority of people not only were here in Austin before, this didn't just draw masses of people from around the country. You've done the point and count point in time counts. It's not a huge difference over time. Again, it just was more apparent.
It's visibility. Yeah.
Exactly. So just the idea that hopefully trying to at least begin to dispel the idea that people are, one, congregating here, and two, are choosing to be in this position, because we know that when we give people housing, I think it's in the 90 something percentile that they're able to escape the situation, the cycle of poverty that have led them there.
And a lot of people don't realize that they have jobs. A lot of them have jobs and they work. They're not like lazy, and that's why they're homeless. And there are people who have mental issues that are not being dealt with, and so that all that goes into the sort of calculus.
That's a great point. I was talking to a guy the other day who's at the corner right by my house. His name is Eddie, and he's a Gulf War veteran, and he receives $400 a month from the VA, and he's got severe PTSD and struggles from a lot of mental health issues. And these are just him telling me these things. But he was saying it's not enough. It's very much appreciated.
400 a month.
400 a month in any city, let alone Austin, is not enough. So it's enough to help him get some food and things like that. But he's nowhere near where he needs to be, and especially obviously as a disabled veteran living on the street, I think he'd be first in line to be able to access those benefits. So.
Yeah. Well, to your point, Austin actually had a successful program to end veteran homelessness just a couple of years ago. And so I thought, when I first heard this talk, I thought we would be doing something similar for everyone else experiencing homelessness, but that obviously is not the case. And it's a lot of work to do. And I think we were pretty fair with the council in giving, what was their responsibility and what was the state's responsibility in all this. But the other thing the council has to do is address affordability broadly across the city for people who are not yet homeless. I'll say for people who are struggling to just afford to live and work in the city. And it's hard because we don't have a lot of the housing. The only two real types of housing you see being built are luxury condos and McMansions in the city. And there's a lot the city and the state, frankly, can do to loosen those regulations to allow more types of affordable housing and attainable housing to be built in this city. And that's just not possible now. So it's really a confluence of a lot of different issues together, and it makes it that much more complicated for solving, but makes it that much easier for someone to take advantage of with this type of rhetoric and just point the finger at whatever one part that is politically convenient. In this case, it's the city council.
And Joe, do you allow cursing on this podcast?
Well, yeah, we do actually. Oh, you know what? I'm thinking about my the Left in Texas podcast. You know what? It's never really come up, quite honestly. But yeah, you go for it.
Just plainly.
I think we're adults here.
Plainly, obviously, the whole kind of theme here is that, this shit is not simple, right? As you're just talking about, from affordability perspective, we have to remember there's also currently an eviction moratorium in place in Austin and around much of the country. And it's not going to stay that way forever, which is scary. It can lead to a lot of people, being without their home relatively soon, right? I think the newest data I saw was 1 in 7 renters in America have missed at least one payment over the past year, right? Yeah. So, and this is not to, for people who are listening, this isn't supposed to scare you or be doom and gloom. The fact that this is a confluence of events that have led us to this point, or fueled homelessness in our country, but it's just an acknowledgement that all these points are intersecting. And so it's difficult as it is to be able to come up with solutions. That's the only way in which we do so. Mm-hmm.
And there is solutions. So that's the number one takeaway, I think, that should be, is that this is solvable. So yeah. So we'll keep working on it.
We'll do it. I appreciate the talk, Joe.
Yeah. Thanks. And to everyone listening, we really appreciate it. Please like and share this content if you do. Our patrons, we really appreciate that. You can actually go to texassignal.com and then become a Patreon member and help support this type of progressive journalism. And, when it comes time to criticize progressives, we'll do that when it's necessary and when we need to do that. And I think in this case, there's some room for that. And we need to recognize, because we can't move forward unless we recognize what the true issues are. Because in this case, I'd say we took steps backwards. Even for our homeless population, we took steps backwards and not forwards. So if we want to, share and expand our values and see that play out in policy, then we've got to be really smart about how we roll these things out, even if we have the best intentions in mind. So with that, thanks again to everyone, and until next time, later, y'all.
See you, Joe.